Chào mừng các bạn đến với khóa Tính cách học năm 2017, buổi 8 về cao Jung và vô sư tử. Các bạn hãy nhấn like và đăng ký kênh nhé. Video xin được bắt đầu.
So we'll continue with our Jungian analysis of the Lion King today. We ended at the point where, remember, Mufasa had taken Simba up to the top of Pride Rock and described to him the fact that his kingdom essentially constituted everything that the light touched. And you can think about that as the domain of the, roughly speaking, of the Great Father, with the domain of the Great Mother on the outside of that being symbolically equivalent to the underworld or to death or to nature. All of those things seem to be approximately equally true. And he forbade Simba from going to investigate what was beyond the confines of the light. And in some sense, that's exactly what a tradition does for you, because the tradition is precisely what defines the domain of the light. And to be moral from the perspective of the tradition, it's akin to playing a Piagetian game, but only adhering to the rules. You know how Piaget described the fact that when kids first master a game, they learn how to act it out, and then they learn what the rules are, and then they regard the rules in some sense as sacred. You can't go outside the rules. And then later in moral development, if they get to that stage, then they start to recognize themselves also as formulators of the rule or formulators of the game. And culture tells you don't go beyond the rules. That's the definition of morality within the box of culture, and you don't go outside of that. And so that's why Mufasa plays that particular role. And it's wise because if you go outside the domain of what you already understand, then it's dangerous out there. Clearly, it's dangerous out there. But the downside of that particular message, and this is the mythological reason why Mufasa isn't as aware as he could be of Scar. You know, his knowledge is bounded, and he's not aware enough of what lies outside of that in this realm, let's say, of death and destruction. And so Scar is able to overcome his brother. Karl Popper, a famous philosopher of science, said that one of the things that you should do, and this is akin to the Piagetian view, is you should always look for information that contradicts your current viewpoint. Now that's painful, right? Because who wants their axioms contradicted? It can take you apart. But it's the only way that you can ensure that you're learning at the same time that you're maintaining your stability. And that's another reason why it's really necessary to engage in dialogue with people that you do not agree with, because they're the ones who will tell you things that you don't know. It's of crucial importance in the maintenance of your own stability. The worst thing that can happen to a person, because there's many horrible things that can happen to a person, but one of the worst things that can happen is that you find yourself in a situation where no one is offering you corrective feedback anymore, because you rely on the corrective feedback provided by other people to keep yourself sane, to keep moving in the ever-changing environment. And if you cut yourself off from that feedback, then you end up static and shrinking. It's really not good. You get less and less competent, you get less and less confident, and the threats outside of you loom larger and larger. So that's all to do with the domain outside the light. See, Jung would also say that out in this domain that's sort of beyond what you understand, that's also where you encounter the archetypes of the collective unconscious. Now that's a really, really complicated idea, but what he means by that is that if you're put outside the domain of your competence, you're going to start to use fantasy to organize your world. So I can give you an example of that. So I presume most of you are old enough to have a conscious memory of when the Twin Towers came crashing down. And so everybody in the days after that was wandering around like they were in a daze. And the reason they were in a daze is because, it wasn't exactly clear what fell, right? There was the physical towers fell, but that was only a tiny bit of the problem, because those physical towers were embedded in a network of meaning, like a very, very sophisticated network of meaning, but also a political network and an economic network and a military network, and like they're nodes inside a very complex system. And so when they come crashing down, you don't know what's come crashing down, right? So you're out there in the unknown and wondering what's going on and wandering around in a daze, which is exactly what happened to people. And then what Bush did, George W., was immediately turn that into a good versus evil drama, instantly. And that's an archetypal idea. So that's when he came up with the idea of the axis of evil. I think that was Iran, North Korea, and I don't remember the other one at the moment. But he immediately turned the political landscape into a good versus evil drama. And he said to everyone in the world that they were either with him or against him, fundamentally. And that was part of the retreating into, I guess, a more protected landscape. That's one of the ways that human beings deal with the encounter with a traumatic threat. And so the reason you meet the unconscious and even the collective unconscious on the border of your knowledge is because when you hit the border of your knowledge, you start to use fantasy in order to bring the newest form of order out of the unknown so that you can start to make sense out of it. And that's what artists always do. That's what they do. And so from the Jungian perspective, people who are engaged in creative art are the ones who are on the perimeter of knowledge structures. And so what they're doing is taking the absolute unknown, which would be, in Rumsfeld's terms, the unknown unknowns, and turning them into partially known unknowns. That's what an artist does. And especially the more classical artists who deal with mythological and religious themes, which was the case for art right up until the late 20th century. They're using these mythological ideas to sort of extend the domain of human knowledge out beyond its current parameters. And so artists do that, and literary people do that, and dramatists do that, and they help us extend our knowledge. Now, all right, so anyways, out there in the underworld, in the place beyond your current conceptualizations, that's the place of death and nature, and it's beyond the light, and it's also the place of hell, and that's what you see here. And how do you conceptualize that? Well, if you're interested in that sort of thing, you could read that. There's another book you could read called Panzram, Panzram, and it's a fascinating book. It's about this guy who, I think he raped 1,200 men. So that sort of tells you what sort of guy he was. Extraordinarily physically powerful and brutal and malevolent. And he was kind of a juvenile delinquent type, and they put him in a reform school, and he was not well treated in that reform school. It's sort of like the worst of the Canadian residential schools. And when he came out, he was not a happy boy. And so he spent the rest of his life trying to be as destructive as he could possibly imagine, and purely, consciously, with malevolent intent. And then, and believe me, he was pretty destructive. He kept track of the dollar value of all the buildings he burned down. He tried to start a war between Britain and the United States. Like, he was all out for all-out mayhem. His dying words that they were going to hang him, he told the guy who was going to hang him, he said, "Hurry up, you Hoosier bastard. I could kill 12 men in the time it takes you to hang me." And that's exactly the sort of person he was. And he made friends with this physician in the prison, who he thought was like the first person who ever did something nice for him, gave him $1 for cigarettes, if I remember correctly, and the physician encouraged him to write his autobiography. And so he did, and it's available. And so if you want a view, because you always think of people, you think, well, people have good intentions, that you especially think that if you're naive and agreeable. So all of you who are sitting there out there thinking people have good intentions, you're probably high in agreeableness. But that's not always the case. People can have very dark motivations that are fully conscious and very well elaborated. And Panzram he was smart. And his book is very well written, and he tells you exactly why he thought the way he thought. And so it's a good glimpse of exactly this sort of thing, where you can get to, if you want to, by brooding on your specific misfortune. And his basic credo was that human beings were so reprehensible that they should just be eliminated. And believe me, that's what he was trying to do. So you can't just be thinking about people who have good intentions but have somehow gone wrong. If you ever meet someone who isn't like that and you think that, you're just a tree with ripe fruit to be plucked. So you don't want to be in that situation. You have to keep your eyes open. And so anyways, that's basically what's encapsulated in this part of the story. Now, the hyenas go after the little lion, obviously, but they manage to escape. It's a very malevolent scene. And Mufasa shows up at the last minute to rescue them. So, and that there's also a mythological trope there, which is that if you go outside your domain of competence and you encounter something you don't understand, the first thing that you're going to do is look to the knowledge structures that you already possess to explain it, right? And that's you could say from a symbolic perspective, that's the manifestation of the Father. because of course that's what you're going to do. And you know, what's really interesting too is because I've had a lot of clients who've had PTSD, and without exception, every single one of them was induced by one form of malevolence or another. They have to develop a very sophisticated philosophy of good and evil to get out of it, because they have a worldview in which those things don't really exist. There's no such thing as pure malevolence. Well, that's fine unless you encounter it. And then as soon as you encounter it, you won't know what to do. And then you won't be able to get on with your life. You'll do nothing but think about that and think about it and think about it and think about it. It'll disrupt your sleep. It'll put you into a permanent state of preparation for action. Because the part of your brain that's detected that, which in my estimation, by the way, is the same part, at least in part, that detects snakes. It's the same damn circuit. Once it's seen something like that, it is not going to let you go till you figure it out. And that's basically what post-traumatic stress disorder is. And you know, to some degree, each of you will have experienced that, maybe not all of you in here, but many of you. And you can tell that. So if you go back and you think about your past, and you have any memory that's more than about 18 months old, and when you think about it, it produces a fair bit of negative emotion, then that's like a place where there's a mini post-traumatic stress problem. And what's happened? You remember I showed you that hierarchy, moving from tiny motor actions all the way up to high-order abstractions? Well, you can imagine, say, you have good person at the top, and you kind of use that scenario to construe other people. People are basically good. Well, then you run into someone who is not good, and boom, the whole bloody system comes tumbling down because it's violated that highest order axiom. So that's post-traumatic stress disorder. If something has violated an axiom that's more differentiated, you know, closer to the actual motor output, not quite so high in the abstraction chain, then all it does is wipe out that part of the structure. It doesn't wipe out the whole thing. And you can tell if you have holes in your perceptual value structure by checking to see if you have memories that are still alive in a negative way that are old enough so that they should have been incorporated into your personality. I had this client once, and she came in and told me that she had been sexually assaulted by her older brother, and she told me the story, and I kind of got the impression that maybe she was like 8 and he was like 17 or something like that. And she was about 27 when she came and talked to me, and then I found out by further questioning that she was 4 and he was 6. And I thought, she still had this story in her head of her being tormented by this older person, right? That's how she told the story. And what I told her was, well, look, another way of looking at this is that you two were very badly supervised children. Because I mean, he was 6, for God's sake. You know, he's a little kid. That doesn't mean that what happened to her was any less traumatic, but he wasn't 17, right? The story was different than the one she had in her head. And, you know, by the time she left, after we had that conversation, it was clear that the way that she was construing the experience had radically shifted. And it's very interesting because, you know, you think of the past as fixed. And it is in some sense, but the reason you remember the past isn't to make an objectively accurate record of the past. It's so that you can use the information in the past to prepare you for the future. And your mind won't leave you alone unless that has happened. So if you've encountered something that's negative and you don't know why and you don't know what to do about it if that happens again in the future, then that will stay with you. And I think one of the things it does too is it increases your overall physiological load. There's actually physiologists who've been talking about this. I can't remember the damn phrase, but you can imagine that your mind is doing something like this all the time. It's got a record in some sense of your autobiographical experiences. And what it's doing is calculating how frequently you've been successful versus unsuccessful. And the more frequently that you've been successful, the higher you are up on the dominance hierarchy. That's one possibility. So your serotonin levels go up and you're calmer. But also, it's reasonable to assume that the environment is less dangerous, right? Because that's sort of what constitutes danger. You're somewhere and you act and something you don't want to have happen happens, that's danger. And so your brain is always trying to figure out how to calibrate how anxious you should be. And one of the things it does is by sort of keeping track of your past success-failure ratio. And so to the degree that your past has been characterized by, we'll call them failures, those are situations where you do not get what you want, then your brain puts your body on constant alert. Because if everything that you've done has resulted in catastrophe, then you're somewhere insanely dangerous and you should be like a like a prey animal that's ready to dart in any direction. And how much you should be a prey animal is dependent on, it's an estimate, partly your trait neuroticism, partly your success as adjudicated by other people, right? Because they'll pop you up the dominance hierarchy if you've been successful, but also partly on your record of failures and successes in the past. And so you can go back and you can find out where you have holes in the structure through which you're viewing the world. That's one way of looking at it. And you can sew those things up. And that's in some sense, that's what you're doing in psychotherapy. Partly it's exposure to things you're afraid of and disgusted by and are likely to avoid. That's a huge chunk of it. But if you go back into your past and you start talking those things through, it's really the same thing. It's more abstracted. So Freud, of course, was always, when he was doing his free association process with his clients, he'd find that if he just let them talk, that their speech would circle until it hit a place like that, where they were confused and doubtful. And then their speech would sort of wander around that, and then they'd have an emotional expression that was a consequence of that. He thought the emotional expression was what was curative. It was cathartic in his terms. But later, James Pennebaker, my exercises are based on his research, he found that if you brought college students to the lab and you had them write for 15 minutes 3 times over 3 days about the worst thing that had ever happened to them, or the worst thing they ever did, if I remember correctly, they got worse in the short term, but better in the long run. For example, they went and visited the doctor less, and markers of their physical health improved. And so I think the reason for that is because they basically calmed down. Once they had gone through the negative memory and sorted it out properly and told a properly articulated story and figured out how to deal with it, then their physiology calmed down. And so then they weren't as stressed, they weren't producing as much cortisol, and so cortisol suppresses your immune function, and so they were more likely to stay healthy. And so, so that's all very much worth thinking about. That's all in the domain outside of the light. That's one way of thinking about it. Now, of course, Simba and what's the girl's name? Mala, yeah. They're, pretty cowed about what has happened, because they sort of stumbled stupidly out into the unknown. They stumbled foolishly out into the unknown. And this actually highlights another Jungian archetype, and that's the archetype of the trickster. And the trickster is like the joker in the king's court. And the trickster is someone who will be or play the fool. And the thing about the fool is that the fool is close to the truth, because you can't learn anything new unless you're willing to be a fool. Right? You know what that's like. You know exactly what that's like. You have to master a new skill, but you're avoiding it because you know that you'll be bad at it when you first do it. And if you're perfectionistic, you're going to say, well, I can't allow myself to be bad at anything. I can't allow myself to be a fool. And no wonder. But the problem is when you try something new, you're always a fool. And so unless you're willing to be a fool, you can't learn anything new. And that's also why Jung regarded the trickster as the precursor to the savior, archetypally speaking, is because you cannot do the right thing unless you're willing to be a fool first. Anyways, Mufasa has a chat with Simba and, tells him that he did what he wasn't supposed to do. Although, even in that situation, Mufasa's discipline is paradoxical, because there's part of him, because he's reasonably wise, that knows that breaking the rules like that is actually necessary. Even though you still have to say, play by the damn rules. You have to leave that door open so that the rules can be broken an appropriate amount. So he forgives him, and peace is made between them, and then they involve themselves in sort of gazing at the night sky. And so the two of them do that together. And the night sky is an interesting place, because that's where the absolute unknown resides. And one of the things Jung wrote a lot about was astrology, strangely enough, / astronomy. And one of Jung's contentions, this is a very interesting one, was that because the night sky was completely unknown, people could project their fantasies into it. And that's what they did with astrology. So astrology is this cumulative fantasy that's going on in the roughly speaking, in the deep unconscious, projected onto the sky. And so if you analyze old astrological writings, what you're really doing is analyzing old fantasies, and because of that, you could develop some insight into the structure of the mind. And so he did the same thing with alchemy in his later writings, which are very, very difficult to understand, but extremely worthwhile. Okay, so anyways, back to the hellish domain. Now, I told you that that domain that's outside of knowledge. You could think about that as the underworld, or you can think about it as nature, the negative element of nature in particular. And so I mentioned that one element of that is hellish, and that's exactly what the movie explains next. It does exactly that. We go back out to this domain that Scar, the adversary, or the negative king, that's another way of looking at him. This is the domain over which he rules. And so you can see him there surrounded in fire. Same idea as the hyenas surrounded by fire earlier, although this is green fire and smoke, which I think is even worse. And this is where the movie starts to draw on essentially Nazi symbolism, at least the symbolism of totalitarian states. And anyways, so what happens out here in this terrible domain where Scar rules is that things turn into a totalitarian state. And he's presented here as a Nazi-like leader. That's the uniformity. And you see he's got this kind of vicious grin on his face, which is malicious and pleased all at the same time. There's no fear in that. It's quite the opposite. And there's another image of, using what's essentially imagery of hell, which everyone understands, strangely enough. And that associates him with the crescent moon. And the crescent moon is, well, it's a symbol of darkness and the underworld fundamentally. So, all right, so anyway, we see the underworld, we see that which lies beyond the light, and in there we see a fragment of that that's basically hellish. And all of that's incorporated into the story. And everyone understands that when they see it, even without, I would say, the overt references to Nazism. Okay, so now Scar has a plan. He's going to kill the king, and he's going to do that by putting what the king loves in danger. And so Scar, feigning sympathy, has enticed Simba down into this ravine, and Scar's minions are going to cause a wildebeest stampede, right? So a mindless stampede to put Simba in danger. And so that's what happens here. The wildebeest start to march into the ravine, and everyone is making a Scar tells Mufasa that Simba is down in that ravine and entices him down there. And so they're all off running to see if they can save Simba. And then you see Mufasa running in front of the wildebeest herd, trying to find his son and trying to stay ahead of them, the mad mob that's put his son in danger. And so he tries to escape, climbing up the butte, which is almost a sheer cliff. And when he gets to the top, his brother is waiting for him there, and he asks him to pull him up. And Scar basically, before he kills him, indicates that he's betraying him and puts his claws into Mufasa's paws and throws him off the cliff. And so that's that, and it's a sad part of the story. It's a hard part that's very hard on kids because the father has died, and it's a rare kid who won't cry about that scene in particular, where you see Simba very upset and his father dying. Now, this is a hard part of the story to interpret. And I don't know if it's because of my lack of ability to interpret or because the story takes a weird twist here, but there is this confusion in the story about whether Simba's an innocent victim who's set up for the murder of his father, or whether he actually bears some guilt for it, and he's broken some rules and so on. So he's not exactly placed in the position of innocence, but of course he's also been set up by Scar. In any case, Scar tells him that it's his fault, pure and pure, and that because of that, he's going to have to leave. He's going to have to be banished beyond the kingdom. Now, you see this motif quite frequently in hero stories, where the hero has to be raised outside of the kingdom. That happens with King Arthur, for example. And it happens with Harry Potter, right? Because Harry Potter is raised by muggles instead of being inside the magic kingdom. So it's a very common theme, and partly what it means is that it means two things. One is that you do grow up alienated from your culture to some degree. There's no way around that, because the culture doesn't match you perfectly, and it doesn't work for you perfectly, and it's old and it's kind of corrupt, and it alienates you as it's shaping you, and so you're going to develop some separation from it. And you see that in intergenerational rhetoric, where the new generation has the proclivity to blame the previous generation for everything that's wrong with the current system. And fair enough, because You do inherit everything that's wrong. Of course, you also inherit everything that's going well, which is a good thing to also notice. But the idea is that you can't help but be alienated from, let's call it the patriarchy for lack of a better word, because it's got a tyrannical element and because it's not matched well to you. So, but then there's also this other issue, which is, well, maybe you're not being successful by the terms that are, by the values that are instantiated in the current system. And you might say, well, that's because the system is set up in an unfair manner, and fair enough. But it's also possibly because you're just not very good at acting out those values, right? So part of the reason you get alienated from your culture is because the culture is corrupt. But another part of the reason is you're just not doing as well as you could be. You're not playing by even your own rules properly. And so you get alienated and you're unsuccessful because of your own inadequacies. And so the movie plays both of those. It's obviously Simba is set up, but there is an intimation that he's not entirely blameless as well. Anyway, Scar comes down into the ravine. It's all foggy now because that goes along with the sort of murkiness of death, and tells Simba that it's his fault and that he's going to have to leave. He's going to have to leave the kingdom of his father, which makes sense now. His father's dead, so how are you going to, once your father has died, how are you going to stay around in his kingdom, so to speak? So, and then Scar tries to get these hyenas to go track Simba down and kill him. So, and Zazu goes back to tell all the rest of the lions that Mufasa is dead and that Simba has disappeared. And then Scar takes over Pride Rock. And so what's happened now is the malevolent element of the king has obtained control over the state, right? And so this is the king, the wise king wasn't paying enough attention. That's one way of looking at it. And so the malevolent part of the state has now got control. This is a very, very old idea. I've traced it back at least several thousand years in its representation in stories. You can see it in Egyptian mythology, for example. So the idea is that as the social structure builds in complexity, it offers you the protection of a functioning complex system, but it also becomes increasingly likely to turn into a tyranny. And because it's more and more powerful, the fact of its potential for tyranny becomes more and more of a danger. And so then the question is, well, what are the factors that encourages it turning into a tyranny? And one factor would be the wise part of it is not paying enough attention to the malevolent part of it. And you could say that's true at the state level, and it's also true at the individual level, right? You have to watch your own proclivity to upset yourself and other people, and take that into account and pay careful attention to it, because otherwise it can gain control, especially because you're going to avoid looking at it. And one of the characteristics of the wise king who gets overthrown by the tyrant is that he has an evil brother and he won't pay enough attention to him. He avoids, he doesn't look. And so the evil king gets the upper hand, and that's what's happened here. And so notice now he takes possession of Pride Rock, not in full daylight, right? But at night. So that ties his rule into the rule of unconscious processes and malevolence. All right, so Simba runs away from the kingdom out into the desert. Now why is that? Well, you remember, and maybe you don't know it, the story of Exodus, when Moses takes the Hebrews out of Egypt, they end up in a desert. Well, why? Well, it's because when you leave a kingdom, no matter how tyrannical, you still fall into disorder. You're out in a place that's desert. There's no civilization there. You know, that's what happened to Iraq after the Americans went in. You know, the Americans, the neocons, were all convinced that the Iraqis would welcome them with open arms and there would be this smooth transition to democracy. Same idea in Libya. It's like, no, that's not what happens. What happens is the state devolves into a desert chaos. And maybe then you can make order, but probably not. And so Simba has left the kingdom, and the first thing that happens is he damn near dies in the desert. And so, you know, if you have an old belief system and it's not working very well and you abandon it, well, good for you, because you're out of the old belief system, but now you're nowhere. One of the things that happens to alcoholics, for example, and other drug addicts as well. So imagine that you're trying to stop drinking. All right, fine. Maybe you have to undergo some medical treatment so when you first stop, you don't die of seizures, because that often happens to people who are addicted to alcohol. So, and they get Valium or something like that from a doctor to see them through the first bits of, what would you call it? Of sobering up. And so they get through it, and then maybe 2 weeks later, they're not physiologically dependent on alcohol anymore. The same thing is true of cocaine. But if you take them back and you put them in their environment, say they go back out of the treatment center, back into the normal world, they start drinking or using right away again. And the reason for that is that, well, let's say you've been an alcoholic for 20 years. Okay, first of all, that's all you do for entertainment. You drink. And all your friends are alcoholics, right? And so, if you're going to stop drinking, not only do you have to rid yourself of the physiological addiction, but you have to completely learn a new way of living. Because what do you know? You have to get rid of all your friends because they're all drunks, pretty much. Or if they're not, they're at least people who are facilitating your drinking. So you have to build a whole new social network. You don't know how to amuse yourself because, of course, the way you've done that is by going to the bar, sitting at home drinking. And so there's a huge hole in your life. You abandon the previous pathological mode of adaptation. But that just leaves you with nothing. And then you have to rebuild that thing from scratch. It's extraordinarily difficult, and that's why so many people fail when they're trying to overcome a major addiction. So, all right, so anyways, Simba's out there in the desert. He's left his family and the comforts of home, and he's discovered by Pumbaa and, what was the little rat's name? Timon? Yes, he's a meerkat, right? Which are very cool things. And they discover him, and this is sort of his transition into adolescence, and he kind of finds, and this is, I would say, more typical of the male transition into adolescence, because females, of course, hit puberty so much younger. The males who aren't very attractive when they're young, and just starting to undergo puberty, they're not very attractive to females. They tend to clump together in gangs and manage the transition over what it could be 7 years. So, and that's what happens here, is Simba joins this little gang of, these guys are all right, but they're a little on the primordial side, you might say. One of them is basically just a walking gastrointestinal tract, and the other one he's not so bad, but he's like, a foot high, really. What good is he? And so he's got some second-rate companions out here past the desert, but he's out of childhood now, and now he enters the adolescent world. And what happens here is that very quickly in the film, he goes from being a little cub to a full adolescence, and there's about a 5-minute transition, and so it's the next stage in his development. And now he's out there in this paradise, which is kind of strange because adolescence really is no picnic. But the idea here is that he really doesn't have any responsibilities, right? None. And that is one thing about adolescence, and even the stage of life that you guys are at, is you have lots to do, but you're not really responsible for anyone other than yourself. And so even though you might be quite burdened with your current responsibilities, it's nothing compared to what it will be like when you have responsibility for children, for example, or for the people that are working for you, or whatever. So anyways, out here, it's a kind of impulsive place as well. He's in a domain now where the impulses of the moment basically take precedence. And I think they sing some song about, Hakuna Matata, right, which basically means do whatever you want and tomorrow will take care of itself, or something like that. So it's very impulsive and lacks all responsibility. One of the things that I would recommend to you if you want to protect yourself from ideological possession, shall we say, is that when you hear people speak politically and they don't say anything about your responsibilities, you should probably stop listening to them. Because whenever they're trying to offer you something, if it doesn't come along with an equivalent cost, there's something being hidden from you. And they're appealing to the part of you that's, well, I would say, at best, adolescent. So, all right, so anyways, he's out there in his little adolescent paradise, and with his dopey chums, and back at Pride Rock, things are not good, right? Scar, who's arrogant and refuses to learn, and who will not establish a reasonable relationship with the females, all he does is tyrannize over them. He ends up ruling over a completely barren landscape. And that's really what happens in totalitarian states. And we also know, quite interestingly, is that one of the best predictors of economic development in a state is the degree to which they extend rights to women. It's one of the best predictors. And I would say, well, if you're going to tyrannize your own women, you're going to tyrannize everything. You're going to tyrannize ideas, you're going to tyrannize structures. Like, if you have to enslave your own women, you've adapted a pretty damn pathological view of the world, and the probability that that narrow, constrained, restricted viewpoint is going to pay off for you economically is extraordinarily low. So now look, the other thing about Scar is he's got the little bird locked up, right? That's the vision of the king. Well, he doesn't want to know anything. He already knows everything. So why does he need this stupid bird flying around telling him what's going on? The last thing he wants to know is what's going on. Yeah. Stalin, I mean, God, you gave that guy bad news or good news, he was going to have you killed. It kept the bad news to a minimum. And that's a real problem, right? Because if you torture people who bring you bad news, then you're never going to learn anything. Well, you don't have to if you already know everything anyways. And so that's the situation here. Well, his little minions, the hyenas, are getting pretty unhappy because they haven't had anything to eat. And the reason for that is they've just stripped the landscape bare. Right? I mean, and I read at the demise of the Soviet Union that something like 10 to 15% of the entire landmass of the Soviet Union had been rendered permanently uninhabitable by industrial pollution. So, you know, and that, I don't remember if that included Chernobyl, you know, where that terrible nuclear accident took place, but there were massive domains of devastation in those countries that, you know, will take hundreds of years to fix. So anyways, when Scar rules, everyone starves. That's a good way of thinking about it, or everyone dies, but that's okay because that's really what he's after anyway, so that works out quite nicely. Now back out here in paradise, I mean, look at him. How pathetic can you get? Look at the expression on that creature's face. You know, he's sated like someone who's just eaten a gallon of ice cream, and he's got this pathetic, self-satisfied, naive, clueless, unconscious grin on his face, which the animators did a very nice job of capturing. Like, that's a complicated expression, and you just want to slap him, and that's exactly what should happen, and that's exactly what does happen. So anyways, he's out there being unconscious dingbat. Well, his society is degenerating, and that's bloody well worth thinking about, because that's an archetypal trope, right? It's like things are sinking around you. The question is, what are you doing about it? You know, are you just staying in kind of a blithe unconsciousness because you can get your next meal, or are you going to wake up and do something about it? Well, that's the call of the self. So now we go back to Rafiki here, and he knows what's going on in the kingdom. He's a symbol of the self. And he also has some inkling that Simba is still alive. So the son of the king is still alive, despite the fact that the land has become ruled by a tyrant and the son is absent. He's still around somehow. And so from the Jungian perspective, there isn't much distinction between the self and the child. The self is the sum total of all possibility, and the child is possibility itself. And so let's say you've become an adolescent, you're all cynical, right? And everything's falling apart around you, which is the typical state of human beings, right? Because adolescents are cynical, generally speaking, and everything's falling apart around them, generally speaking. And so what do you have to do in order to do something about that? Well, one is you have to be drawn by the call of wisdom, and the other part is that you have to rediscover that part of yourself that's a childlike part, that's associated with the sun and associated with that early, you know, the early exposure of Simba to the sun. You have to find that again, and then trust that some childlike exploration and a bit of manifestation of faith might get you to the next place. And so that's what's happening here with the little, you know, the baboon in the tree and the drawing. So anyways, he knows that Simba's alive now, and so he goes off to find him. And meanwhile, Simba and his dopey companions are out hunting for bugs, you know, because he's a lion, you know, he shouldn't be eating bugs, for crying out loud, but they're easy. And so you see this scene where Pumbaa goes after this bug, and then another lion shows up and chases him. So she's going to kill him and eat him. I suppose you could think about this. One of the things that happens in late adolescence is that the formation of male gangs is often broken up by the proclivity of one or more members of that gang to get involved in an individual romantic relationship. And so anyways, they're pretty freaked out about this. And so then Simba goes out and has a fight with this lion to protect his dopey chums, and they have this huge fight, and Nala, who it turns out to be, pins him. And so that goes back to the beginning of the story, where when he first encountered her, she pinned him all the time. She's an anima figure, right? And now what she does immediately is shame him. So he's an anima figure in part. She's an anima figure in part because she actually does shame him, right? So she's the gateway to higher consciousness. She makes him self-conscious, and rightly so. But she's also a psychological figure, because imagine that when a young man is establishing a relationship with a young woman, and he's enamored of her, he's falling in love, he projects an ideal onto her, and that ideal is going to be partially fulfilled by the relationship. The degree to which is unspecified, and sometimes it'll collapse completely. But he projects an ideal onto her, because otherwise he wouldn't be attracted to her, and then the ideal judges him. And so that makes him feel all self-conscious and useless, which is useful because he is useless and should feel that way. And so it's part of the impetus to growing up. So, and of course, and you're not going to feel that impetus unless adopting the responsibility has some sort of payoff. And women tend to mate across and up dominance hierarchies, so they tend to actually like men who are useful. And so if they encounter a man who isn't useful at all, that's exactly what's going to happen. They're going to not be happy about that in the least. And no wonder, and I think the reason for that, it's an economic and a biological reason. The reason is that women are in the position of having to take care of infants primarily. And an infant is a very heavy load. And so even a woman who's extraordinarily competent is going to find herself substantially limited in her possibilities if she has an infant. And so then she's looking around for someone who will pick up part of the load. It's perfectly reasonable. And you're not going to pick up part of the load if you're completely useless. So anyway, she pins him. And then he's all resentful about it immediately, because she's calling him on his stupid friends and the fact that he's out there gallivanting impulsively in paradise when there's real problems to be solved. And so look at him, he's all resentful and useless and you know, feeling put upon and picked upon, and you got to slap him again fundamentally. And she's just completely stunned by that. It's like, and tells him, you know, where's the Simba I used to know, right? He's a little doubtful about the whole situation there. The animators do a very nice job of this part of the movie, because one of the things you see is that his eyebrows are always pointing up in the middle, whereas his father's eyebrows were pointing down in the middle. And so that's the difference between this, which is sort of like things are happening to me, and this, which is more like I'm imposing my will on things. And that's an immature face, and the animators capture that brilliantly. So here's where she shames him again. She tells him how much she liked him when he was little, and you know, a potential king, and how hurt she is that he's this useless, you know, wide-eyed, naive, impulsive, pleasure-seeking adolescent. And she tells him that she missed him, and God only knows why, because look at him again. It's like completely appalling creature. And this is when Pumbaa and Timon sing that song about the fact that, you know, their friend's doomed because, you know, this girl's got him. And then they switch into another archetypal scene, and so they're falling in love here. And so the paradisal imagery is really highlighted in the movie. And so they go off and have this like romp, self-reflective romp through this new paradise. And they wrestle around and play. And then he pins her more or less, and she licks him. That's not so good. And this is one of the most brilliant shots, I think, that the animators managed, because she's obviously pushing this a little bit farther than he knows what to do with. And so they're wrestling, and she licks him, and then she lays down and makes this face, which is, every single class I've ever showed this to, all laugh when they see that image. And that's a good example. So Freud said that jokes were a good route into the unconscious. So the question is, and this is an archetypal facial expression, and everyone knows exactly what it means. There's something sexually seductive about it, something very sexually seductive about it, despite the fact that it's a lioness. And the animators do an extraordinarily good job of capturing that. And so that has a huge effect on him. Well, these guys know that like, the game's up, man. It's like they know they're dead. Whatever attractions they can offer are paling in comparison to this. So anyways, things don't really progress past that, but he gets a hint of her longing for him, what's waiting for him if he grows up, and the fact that she's completely disappointed in him because he's so completely useless. And so now he's lounging about, like some basement dweller with Cheeto dust all over his chest and trying to justify his absolutely useless life and, saying that he doesn't have any responsibility to the devastated kingdom and he's out there where Hakuna Matata, I can just do whatever I want and follow my impulsive pleasures, and she thinks he's pretty pathetic, and the reason for that is because he is actually pretty pathetic, and she tells him that, she's extraordinarily disappointed, and he gets all pouty about it. I mean, even here you see when he's got kind of an aggressive look on his face, there's still nothing about it that's commanding. It's petulant, right? It's like, well, now I'm irritated, but he's got no force and still completely appalling in this particular situation. So she judges him very harshly and leaves, and that makes him think. He gets all self-conscious because this female that he admires wants to have nothing to do with him, and so first of all, then he thinks, well, maybe I'll just hate all women, which is, pretty pathetic conclusion, but a very common one. And the next is, well, maybe there's actually something wrong with him, right? Which is a very painful bit of self-reflection. So he notes that there's something wrong with him, and then he calls out to his father and says, look, you said you were always going to be here for me, and you're not. And so what's happening is that he's become aware of the insufficiency of his current adolescent value structure, and he wants something beyond it, which would be associated with identification with the father. But he can't find the father. The father's dead. It's like when Pinocchio goes down to the bottom of the ocean to bring Geppetto up from the depths, right? That's the situation that Simba finds himself in right now. The father's gone and has to be brought up from the depths. So this is where the movie takes the archetypal pathway of an initiation ceremony. So he says he wants to change. Now, one of the things Carl Rogers, one of the clinicians that we'll talk about, pointed out was that if someone was going to come to psychotherapy, there's some things that had to happen before they went into psychotherapy. And one thing that had to happen was that they had to admit that there was something wrong, and they had to want to change. You had to have that before you went into the psychotherapeutic situation. And what happens here is Simba is he's dropped his arrogance, and he's looking upward, kind of like Geppetto wishing on the star in Pinocchio. He's looking upwards, he's looking towards something higher, and he wants to transform himself. So he's asked the question, how can I change for the better? And he doesn't get an answer. And then Rafiki shows up. So what does that mean? It means that as soon as you know you're wrong about something, as soon as you admit that you're wrong about something, and you open the door to potential change, that part of you will respond. So, and you know this because, think about this. You're thinking. So you ask yourself a question, because that's what you do when you're thinking, and then you generate some answers. It's very strange. The thinking will actually work. You can actually come up with answers if you think about something. And so this issue is, okay, I thought I was real good in my little impulsive paradise, but then it turns out that I'm just a half-wit, and I noticed that, and I want to do something about it. So the question has now been posed. And what Jung would say is the deeper part of yourself, the part that still contains your undeveloped potential, will respond to that posed question and change the way that you look at things and change the way that you act. It'll start changing things so that you can tap those parts of yourself that are not yet developed. Anyways, Rafiki shows up, and Simba is sitting by the water, self-reflecting, and there's a little pebble that drops into the pool to attract his attention, and up pops the self. And Rafiki's a trickster. He tells him weird jokes, and he hits him with a stick a bunch of times, thank God, because someone really needs to. And he makes some stupid jokes about bananas and kind of entices Simba into following him, right? He lets him know that he has a secret, and he entices Simba into following him. And so Simba's all of a sudden become interested in something. So if you ask yourself what the next developmental stage is, and you really want to know, then all of a sudden you're going to become interested in things that might move you to the next stage. And that'll happen more or less unconsciously. So anyways, Rafiki entices him and then runs away. And Simba follows him. And well, that's where he reveals himself as a sage. And then he tells Simba to follow him, and he goes underground. And this is the initiation scene, right? Which we talked about at the beginning of the class. This is the descent into the underworld. And it's a prerequisite to radical personality transformation. So anyways, he goes through this horrifying underground tunnel system where everything's all tangled up, which is, you'll know if you ever fall into chaos, that everything down there in chaos is tangled up. It's a tangled mess. And and there's horrifying music going on in the background, and he goes deeper and deeper until Rafiki says he finds a pool in the middle of the chaos, a deep pool. And that's another symbol of the self. It's the deep unconscious. There's something down there that's alive that can be drawn up to the surface. And so Rafiki shows him the pool, and Simba, who's quite terrified at this point, looks in it, and the first thing he sees is he only sees himself. He only sees his own reflection, and Rafiki says, look deeper. Now you see what the animators do here. It's very cool. So there's Simba, and there's his reflection, but you see that is already half his father, and you look at the difference in the eyebrows and the look. So there's a tightness of jaw and a firmness of face that's starting to manifest itself there, and that means that he's starting to see the man he could be beyond the adolescent. That's a good way of thinking about it. And then all of a sudden, well, there, that's a whole different face, right? That's a seriously different face. That, everything's going in, and that, it's like, get out of my way, because things are going to happen around me. Very judgmental as well. So it's not naive by any stretch of the imagination. But, we know his father's a good guy, and so there's something archetypal about this. And so he sees the man he could be reflected back to him, and then that actually becomes a cosmic event, and we switch up to the sky instead. And so Mufasa manifests himself basically as a solar deity, and he tells Simba that he's forgotten who he is, which is the son of a king, and that he should remember that and start acting like it. And that's an archetypal idea. So if you're just a useless adolescent, then you've forgotten who you are. And the consequence of that is that the state is going to fall apart around you, and you're not going to do anything to fix it, and you're not going to be good for anything, and no one's going to be able to rely on you, and you're going to be all whiny and resentful. And then after that, it even gets worse. And so that's basically what Mufasa tells him. And so Simba is like blown away by this vision, right? Because he sees what he could be and also what he's not, which is pretty damn horrifying. So anyways, the storm, so to speak, clears, and Rafiki comes up, and Simba's a lot more thoughtful and not quite as whiny and resentful anymore. And so Simba now knows what he's supposed to do. He's supposed to stop being useless and take on the moral requirements of setting the kingdom straight. And so he runs back across the desert. There's all sorts of impressive music happening, and then he comes back to his kingdom, and it's not looking so good. And that's the consequence of his abandonment of it. That's a big part of it. So now it's dead, but also his abandonment of it to nothing but malevolence and chaos. And so he's pretty taken aback at what's happened, and that he exaggerates his guilt, or it should anyways. And Nella shows up, and they decide they're going to do something about this. So in the meantime, Simba's mother is complaining about the fact that there's no food in the kingdom anymore, and that they've gone as far as they can, and Scar doesn't want to hear this, so he attacks her, and Simba decides to go to war. And so this is where he wakes up, and he's willing to encounter the shadow at this point. And so he confronts Scar, and Scar's very concerned about this, because actually Simba's looking pretty impressive now, and he thought he was dead besides. And so he tries to use treachery and whininess and subordination to excuse himself, but he's planning to overthrow Simba nonetheless, to resist him. So he tells Scar to leave. He's going to banish him to the nether regions outside of the kingdom, like Scar did to him. And Scar basically refuses. And then a storm gathers, right? And lights the deadwood around the rock on fire. So we have another kind of descent into hell scene here. Very common in Disney movies, this notion of the hero fighting the evil force on the edge of something that's burning. It's quite a common motif. You see it in Sleeping Beauty, for example. So they have a big war, and Scar ends up putting Simba in the same position that Mufasa was in, and then he whispers to him that he killed his father. So Simba's been thinking all along that it was only his fault, and it is sort of his fault, but he didn't know that there was a more archetypal theme playing out in the background, which is that societies are always endangered by malevolence, always, and that's independent to some degree of Simba's decisions and his lack thereof. Anyway, Scar tells him because he thinks he's won, and that energizes Simba to have this sort of final battle. He leaps out from the pit, and they have a big fight, and he pins him, basically. And the female lionesses come to his aid, and Simba tells him that, again, that he has to leave. And so they have a big fight. That's a particularly good bit of animation. So there's a real demonic aspect to Scar there, sort of king of hell imagery. But he loses. And then he blames his minions. He blames the hyenas for everything terrible that's happening, forgetting that they can hear him. And then he falls off the cliff, and the hyenas go in and finish him off. So it's a pretty brutal ending for poor old Scar, eaten by his own minions. And then Scar's dead, and Simba has won, and so the rains come immediately. And so what does that mean? Well, it means that when proper order is restored in a kingdom, then everything starts to flourish again. And so the rains come, and then while it's raining, Simba climbs up to the top of the rock, and now he's completely mature, right? The pathetic facial expression disappears entirely, and he straightens himself up because now he's full of serotonin after having defeated good old Scar, and all the lionesses are roaring, and he climbs up Pride Rock, and they roar at him, which is good. They're tough, and he's tough, and they're showing their teeth. It's not a society of naive and harmless creatures. It's something that's got some bite. And the rains come, and then the next thing you see is the restoration of the kingdom. And so basically what that means is that if the individual is willing to confront their own shadow and then to take on the malevolent forces that continually undermine society, then harmony can be restored and everyone can do well. And so then we have a return to the beginning, right? And so Simba and Nala are now a couple, along with Pumbaa and Timon, and they have a baby, and Rafiki shows up and does the same thing. He's going to present the baby to the sun and have all the animals bow again, and that's the end of the movie. So that's all packed. That's all packed into an archetypal tale. And so one of the things that Jung would point out is that you all understood this, right, while you were watching it. Because otherwise, at some level, all of these things made sense. They all cohered, and the narrative appeared to be an appropriate narrative, even when you're a little kid. Because it strikes a chord inside you, and well, that chord, the thing that it strikes inside you, that's the archetype. Because if there wasn't something inside of you, so to speak, that this could communicate with, then it would fall on deaf ears. And it speaks to the part of you that's most particularly human. And it's a story of the development of the sovereign individual. That's the right way to think about it. It's a hero archetype. That's another way of thinking about it. And people are going to get that story one way or another. And so, well, that was actually faster than I thought it would be today. So why don't you think for a minute or two, and I'll take some questions, which I don't often do, and they can be any questions about anything we've covered in class. So take a minute and yes.
This is a question about archetypes. It's like I have this feeling. Sometimes you watch a movie and you feel like you know the character, but it's not exactly that character. Like what comes to mind is Gandalf from Lord of the Rings. Like it feels like you know that sort of wise old man.
Archetype. Yeah. Yeah, well, there's not much difference between Gandalf and who's the wizard in Harry Potter? Dumbledore. They could be the same guy. It's right. And so, well, that is precisely the indication of the existence of an archetype. It's like, and a movie One time a student asked me, well, if there are these archetypes, why don't we just tell the archetype over and over? Why do we need fiction, for example, which is like a bridge? If there's individuals here and the archetype is up here, you know, at a high level of abstraction, fiction sort of fills the gap between them. And so what you want is a story that's archetypal so that you understand its basic structure, but you want enough variation and specificity so that it's new and interesting and also applicable to you. So you have to humanize the archetype to some degree, otherwise it's so abstract you can't relate to it. And good stories really do that. They bridge the gap, and some of them are more. But if they're completely non-archetypal, there's nothing about them that captures you. It doesn't have any force. And then if it's too archetypal, well, it gets to be too abstract and you can't relate to it. So good fiction writers and good purveyors of dramatic entertainment, we think about it as entertainment, are really good at occupying that middle position. So, yeah. And they reveal the archetype through the individual. That's one way of thinking about it. And that keeps it fresh. And, you know, one of the things that Jung pointed out too was that you're going to be manifesting archetypal patterns of behavior in your life whether you know it or not. Even when you do something like fall in love, because that's going to be a very particular experience for you, but it's also a very common experience at the same time, right? And romance is older than people. That's one way of looking at it. I mean, because sex is older than human beings, and so you're in the grip of something that's really ancient, but at the same time it's really personal. And so a good novelist or writer of fiction is able to capture both the personal element of that, to show the transpersonal within the personal. And in some sense, your destiny, proper destiny from a Jungian perspective, is to consciously express an archetype. And so it would be the archetype, there's a bunch of them, but one of them would be the archetype of the hero, and you're supposed to manifest that in the conditions of your own life. So that makes the archetype real in the conditions of your own life. And Jung would also say that when you're doing that, your experience will manifest itself as meaningful. And so it's because in some sense you're acting in accordance with your deepest instincts, technically speaking, right? You're acting out what it means to be human in the world. And you're going to find that meaningful. Okay, good. We'll see you on Thursday when we're going to do a speed review of Freud.